Good morning. Welcome back to the Mind the Gap podcast, which is your essential guide to bridging the gap between healthcare for Black and Brown people. And together we'll dive into a world of inclusive dermatology, as well as challenges faced by people of color in healthcare. Each episode, we're joined by various experts, patients, and advocates as we discuss critical healthcare topics, share inspiring stories, and uncover groundbreaking research. Our mission is to educate and advocate for better healthcare practices that cater to diverse skin tones in our global community. Today, I'm joined by Saadiya. Saadiya is an expert patient, and we would love to have a great conversation with Saadiya. So, welcome to the podcast, Saadiya.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I would love to hear more. Like me and you have already spoke, but I would love to hear more for the listeners. Who is Saadiya, and what brings you onto the Mind the Gap podcast today?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Sadia, and I work as a consultant in my day job. But then, in 2020, I started a platform called the Invisible Crisis, and this started as a way for me to share my experience of life with a chronic illness, more specifically sickle cell anemia, and share just insights that I've learned and picked up on navigating life with a chronic illness, whether that's navigating doctor's appointments and paramedics and healthcare professionals and the conversations you have with them, or navigating school and homework and assignments and deadlines, or navigating the corporate world, and working with different people, managers, talking about illness and health in a working environment, which can be quite a daunting thing to do. So yeah, that's my mission at the moment, is just to help as many people as they can understand how they can advocate for themselves and just feel confident in having those maybe awkward or daunting conversations in different parts of their lives.
And to touch on like different parts of their lives, you mentioned how this was something that you navigated from school to work to
Mhm.
university. I would love if you could take us all the way back to the beginning, the early points when you found out that you had sickle cell. How did that come about? And what was your experience almost getting a diagnosis like?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, sickle cell is a genetic blood disorder. So you're born with it, and most people are diagnosed when they're a child. So for me, I was diagnosed, I think, 3 years old. So I've never known life without sickle cell, essentially. And my experience, I grew up in the UK, different countries in the UK, and so I've experienced healthcare in different parts of the UK, in different areas of the UK. And my experience, I guess, for me and also for my parents, was just one of learning and understanding, because my parents had no idea what sickle cell was at the time. And so for them, it was just trying to understand what my triggers were, and then inform me of that as I grew up. But in terms of, I guess, school and education, it was again a lot of informing people, a lot of informing teachers, a lot of having to be the expert, essentially, and talking about why I've taken off time from school, or why I need an extension on my essays, and then kind of carrying on that role into university as well. And I think in university there's a lot more structure around it, so you can ask for extenuating circumstances if you've missed a deadline, if you have a reason for that. You can do resets and things like that. So there are structures in place, and I think across the board or across universities in the UK, it's pretty good. For me, the problem came when I left university and I left education and I started working, because I've worked in a number of places. And while in the UK you have legal rights as someone with a chronic illness, each company is different in terms of their policies. So, for example, one company I worked for had a policy where you couldn't take more than X amount of days sick leave within a 6-month time frame. And obviously, for someone like me or anyone else who has a chronic illness, that's a very tricky thing to navigate, because it's unpredictable and you can't really like dictate to your body when to be well and healthy and when to be sick. So I'd say navigating that transition from childhood and education into the corporate world and the working world was probably one of the trickiest things I've had to do. And yeah, there isn't really like a guide for doing that. So hopefully I
Mhm.
can provide people with a bit more information and knowledge on how to do that. And also just having the confidence to talk to your manager and say, actually, you know, these are the reasonable adjustments that I need. And legally you have to kind of abide by them.
So for someone who's listening to this, who maybe is let's say, just come out of university, going into a grad job at a McKinsey or a Deloitte or Goldman Sachs, entering the corporate world. You mentioned about people having legal rights when they have a chronic illness. Could you maybe like talk more about what those legal rights are and how maybe people should navigate that world to get a better understanding of it?
I guess the first thing to think about or talk about is reasonable adjustments. So if you have a chronic illness, you're entitled to talk to your employer and HR about requesting reasonable adjustments. So this can range from special equipment, a special laptop or chair to do your work better and help you kind of perform your tasks. It can be flexible working, so maybe working from home more often. Obviously now with post-COVID, that's a bit more normalized, but there are still places that require people to go into the office. It could be time off for hospital appointments or just kind of like understanding that need for flexibility. For me, a lot of my reasonable requirements kind of catered around temperature of the the office when I was working in the office. So for sickle cell patients, the cold is a major trigger. And so a lot of offices in the UK have air conditioning, obviously just to kind of help circulate the air around the office. And so for someone like me sitting underneath AC for 8 hours a day would leave me in pain at the end of the day. And it was just a cycle that I really could not keep doing. So one of my reasonable adjustments was requesting them to either turn off the AC or to provide me with a heater. So really depends on what your condition is, but you can request reasonable adjustments. And the way that you do it is you just go to your HR team or you talk to your manager. They may ask to see a doctor's note or just a bit more information about why you're requesting that. And then they should provide it for you. As like I said, it has to be within the confines of like what is reasonable for them to do. But for the most part, they should accommodate your needs as it is a legal requirement.
Have you ever come across any resistance when requesting some of these adjustments to be made?
So when I was requesting for the AC to be turned down, I got a lot of pushback. It took them about 8 months, which is a long time. It really shouldn't take 8 months for them to accommodate your reasonable adjustments. Um, but a lot of the pushback was around, health and safety, and we can't turn off the AC because it's centralized. We can't give you a heater because it's a health and safety risk. We can't do this. We can't do that. And I think obviously in that moment I was very frustrated. Uh, it can be hard to convey to someone that something as simple as AC is causing me to go home in pain every single day, especially if you're not with, when you're home by yourself, you're by yourself and no one is kind of witnessing that side of you. So it's hard. I can understand that it's like hard to have that conversation with your manager because when you do go to work, you look fine, especially if you have an invisible illness. No one is going to know how you're kind of feeling on the inside. But that was definitely a learning experience for me to kind of keep pushing and be persistent and not give up and kind of like go to the next person. If my manager is pushing back, I'm going to my manager's manager. I'm going to HR. I'm going to the head of HR. Like I'm not going to kind of be silent because at the end of the day, I'm the one who's going to deal with it, and I'm the one who is going to be in hospital, or I'm the one who's going to, you know, buying extra painkillers and medications. So yeah, I would just say to just keep pushing because it is a legal right.
I think that's great for like that's great for people who maybe have been navigating the corporate world with an invisible illness and almost feeling lesser than because they can't mention to people that there is an invisible illness that they have in the fear of almost losing their job maybe or being replaced or not being able to have access to further opportunities. Whilst you were speaking, you mentioned also about how if the AC was left on for too long at work, it could eventually lead to you even going to hospital. Living with your chronic illness, has there ever been a time where you were in hospital as a result of something that happened at work?
I would say more in terms of stress. Stress again is another factor, and I think it's been a real balancing act for me to kind of obviously want to do my job well, meet deadlines, take on work that will help me kind of get promoted or seen, by managers, but then also know my limits and know when to say no and be okay with saying no. I think that's another thing that people with chronic illness kind of or invisible illness maybe struggle with is you can't take on as much as maybe your colleague who doesn't have a chronic illness because it's just your body is going to react to it, especially if stress is a trigger. So I've definitely kind of learnt my experience with that, and I have had instances where I've kind of pushed myself and worked beyond my limits, and I've kind of seen the repercussions of that the next day or the following week, for example.
That's interesting. I think it's something, it's a side of healthcare that people often never consider that much, that actually people have lives and everything else that to go on. And healthcare is something that is with you no matter where you go. So we've kind of touched on how to navigate the corporate world and the world of work, living with sickle cell. What about if we flip the table and we almost talk about navigating going through the healthcare system? How, like, when you go to the doctor or go to the hospital, what your experience has been like there, and almost any advice that you may have for people just based on your experiences alone.
So, like I said, I grew up in different places around the UK, so Liverpool and Nottingham and Exeter, and now I'm in London. And in London, there's definitely more of like a system around treating people with sickle cell. But when I was in Exeter, for example, there was an instance where I was in hospital and no one in the hospital knew what to do with a sickle cell patient. So they had to call the next hospital and ask them, like, hey, we have this patient who has sickle cell. What do we give her? How do we treat her? So it's definitely, I think, with something like sickle cell, it's been a case of me knowing myself and my body and what kind of triggers me and what helps me, what specific painkillers and medication kind of has worked in the past through trial and error, and then communicating that with the doctors. So it's kind of like we're working as a team, but it has taken a long time to kind of get to that point. A lot of pushback, even calling 999 as an emergency and kind of hearing, oh, but actually it's not that bad. You look fine. You're not crying. So you didn't need to call us. You could have just walked in. And things like that kind of really can get to you after a while. But like I said, no one knows how much, especially if it's invisible, no one knows how much pain you're actually in. And so I think your experiences are 1000% valid. If you are in pain, you are in pain. Like even if a doctor is standing in front of you telling you no you're not, that's not true because just because they're a doctor. So you learn after a while just how to advocate for yourself and how to have those conversations with doctors and also what doctors are looking for. I think sometimes going in with the facts, with you've kept, a diary, a medical diary for like a week or a month prior, or exactly, okay, my symptoms happen because at 2 o'clock I did this, or weather's dropped, or whatever it is, just having that information available, I think can just help your case a bit better.
Have you ever found yourself in a place where you've had to almost exaggerate those things that doctors are looking for, or is that not something which you've had to do?
I think more so for first line kind of healthcare professionals, so for nurses or paramedics, like I said, because they're the first people that kind of meet me when I'm in crisis. And because I've gotten so used to the pain, I'm not, I guess, crying on the floor, for example, which is what they typically would look for. And so I've had to kind of communicate to them, actually, this is not exaggerate. I wouldn't say I exaggerate, but really kind of make them aware that just because I'm not crying or just because I look fine does not mean that I am. So yeah, but in terms of exaggeration, I wouldn't say that I typically have had to do that.
And when you say like look fine, one thing that I've come across in like a lot of the work that we've done as well is in medicine, typically when we say someone looks fine, like it's the absence of being like pale. It's the absence of just like there is a typical overlook of an ill patient. So like if you imagine like a child who's like 8 years old, if they're just sitting very reserved, very quiet in a corner, that usually tells you something's wrong. And almost like an adult, if they're pale, struggling to breathe, that tells you that something is wrong. When you say like people are looking for what looks fine, like what does that mean specifically for you?
I think people, again, with sickle cell, because it is a pain, people expect people in crisis to be, I don't know, on the floor crying out in pain, in agony. And it does happen. And I myself kind of like have done that in the past. But then there are times where, because you're so used to the pain and the level of the pain after a lot of years, that you're not like, I find myself not doing that because I'm able to kind of like just, I guess, try and focus on something else or try and take my mind off the pain or whatever, but I know that the pain is still there. So I think people definitely look for crying, shouting, not being able to stand, not being able to think or talk coherently. So yeah, and I can see that that does happen, but in the cases where it doesn't happen, I don't think the patient should be vilified, for not showing those signs.
I just want to now almost move the conversation on to something that you mentioned earlier about how your journey of living with sickle cell has also been your family's journey of understanding how they can help you with living with sickle cell. How do you think for somebody who maybe is listening to this and doesn't have sickle cell, but knows somebody, a family or a friend with sickle cell, how can they almost best support somebody living with sickle cell or any invisible chronic illnesses?
I would say, I guess, understand or learn about the condition that your friend or family member has. Obviously, Googling is an option, but I think having the conversation with them is better because you then know exactly how it's impacting them specifically in their body and what their triggers are. And just asking what they need from you, and then kind of maybe following up, for example, again, with me and the cold, checking in during winter time and just asking, hey, obviously it's really cold outside. Do you need anything? Like, are you okay? Or even if you're catching up with a friend and just asking, hey, how's your health going? Like, I think a lot of people maybe avoid that conversation or have asking that question because, oh, it's too heavy, or I don't want to bring it up, or maybe they like it's awkward, or maybe I don't want to upset them. But when I catch up with my friends and they ask how I'm doing in regards to my health, I think that shows a level of like care and understanding and willingness for them to like learn and help as well. So yeah, just embracing that is a part of their life and it will always be a part of their life if it's a long lasting condition. But then I guess on the flip side, it's also being careful not to like offer them unsolicited advice or kind of say, hey, I saw this thing about if you take like 3 garlic cloves and like, drink that or whatever, then you're going to be cured. So you should try that. So I think there's definitely like a balance between between the two.
And on the topic of unsolicited advice, building the company that we're building, like I think I've heard almost every single variation of unsolicited advice just from speaking to people like yourself. What are some of the things that people have told you in the past that you just thought, this is absolutely crazy? And also, was there anything that sounded crazy that maybe you tried and you thought, oh, actually, there is a bit of legs to this?
I'd say luckily I haven't had anyone kind of suggest anything crazy. I think the most has been just kind of like, oh, you should eat healthy, or you should like eat lots of spinach, or you should try this or whatever. And obviously, eating healthy is recommended for every single person, whether or not you have a chronic illness. But I think there's a misconception that you have a chronic illness because you're not taking care of yourself, or that you haven't been eating healthy, or you haven't been working out. And actually, chronic illness happens just because it happens. And especially with something like sickle cell that is genetic, there's no amount of like eating healthy that can cure, quote unquote, cure that condition. Obviously, it helps and it helps you maintain it day to day. But I think when someone is very dismissive and like, oh, just eat healthy and you'll be fine, it kind of really it's not acknowledging actually you're dealing with something every single day and it is lifelong and it is very serious, and it kind of puts the onus on you as the patient to take care of yourself, which you should be doing, but like if you're not well, then it's your fault, and that's not the case. And I think people with chronic illness battle a lot with like guilt around blaming themselves that they have this condition, but it's not. that's not the case and that's not your fault. But I think in terms of what people have recommended, I think I see on social media a lot people talking about someone called Dr. Sebi and like an alkaline diet and stuff like that. And I think social media is a real kind of breeding ground for a lot of misinformation, and a lot of like, oh, just eat this every single day and you'll be fine. And it's, yeah, I don't know. I just think like, as if you don't have the condition, then you can't really kind of say that this is a cure. And a cure is something that you would go to the doctor for after doing multiple tests and like figuring out what works for you.
I think as social media, it plays a massive part in the transmission of just general information. And then when we apply healthcare to that, there is a lot of information that travels on social media, which doesn't necessarily have any evidence base sometimes. As long as it can get enough likes, then all of a sudden that's like the most validity that we give to a piece of information. And like, yeah, some of the names that you mentioned have been recommended to us so many times. And when we've gone to look for almost the evidence base around those topics, it's often very hard to find or the information is conflicting. Yeah, like it almost feels like people will believe anything that they can believe as long as it,
Mhm.
like, it's almost like it's one or the other. And people don't like to accept that two things can be true at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a lot of mistrust for doctors or kind of like Western medicine in general, and kind of like taking pills and medication and this. And I think, like you said, two things can be true at the same time. So you can be on medication, go to your doctor, take your tests, and also, eat healthy. But I think the problem comes when you eliminate one for the other. So
Mm.
yeah, people have to be really careful about that.
And you touched on the mistrust generally for like Western medicine and just taking pills or like the medicine that we typically know, like in the NHS, for instance. Why do you think there is a mistrust specifically surrounding the condition of sickle cell?
I think it stems from a lack of knowledge of what it was. So I guess if you think back to maybe when my parents had me and they didn't know, and they have a child who's crying all the time, like, oh my goodness, especially being Nigerian, I think the thoughts would be like, oh my goodness, like someone's done something, what is this, like why is our child sick, and kind of like, oh, let's just kind of give her, I don't know, herbs or whatever. I think there's an idea that like, I don't know, there's an idea that your health can be kind of managed through kind of traditional means, and understanding the body and understanding how the body works is kind of vital to like knowing that actually there's more to the body than just kind of what you put into it, what you eat. Sometimes the way that the body works can be different to someone else. And then in terms of, I guess, mistrust for doctors, I think maybe that stems from, again, just a lack of like community or connection. Going to a doctor who is typically in this country, maybe he's white and he's kind of like he's not familiar, I guess, with the cultural context of maybe a Nigerian family or an Asian family. And so again, there's that like language barrier, not necessarily language barrier, but maybe a cultural barrier of like trying the doctor explaining to the parents who has a sick child what it is, but obviously the doctor's explaining it from a very like scientific background. So kind of having those conversations, but more on like a community level or more on like a personal level, I think is really important.
I think you mentioned something which was really interesting, and it's almost the how like if there is a doctor or a healthcare professional watching this, one of the things that you mentioned is that sometimes the mistrust exists because of the difficulty overcoming that cultural barrier that exists for specifically, for instance, a Nigerian family. And I wanted to find out how you almost overcome the cultural barrier if a doctor's listening to this, how they can overcome the cultural barrier for Nigerian communities specifically?
I think it's a really good question. I think obviously, firstly, you're a doctor, so you're talking from a scientific point of view, but being able to kind of break down that information into something that's a bit more accessible for just kind of like an everyday person, first and foremost. And then also as a doctor, just being, I don't want to say human, but like being a bit more kind of down to earth, I guess. I remember I had a doctor many years ago and I was in a lot of pain in hospital, and obviously she was being a doctor, she was giving medication and telling me like what they're giving me and stuff like that. And then she kind of did something that she kind of got down because I was in bed, and she got down to my level. She held my hand and was like, "I'm so sorry you're experiencing this. I know it's really painful. I'm gonna try, you know, what I can to help." And I think just that level of like switching from doctor mode to her being another human being, acknowledging that I'm also a human being in that situation was really helpful. So, yes, being aware of like your patients and seeing them as like you mentioned earlier, people who have lives outside of their health. They have school and work and family obligations and hopes and fears and stuff like that. And I know it sounds cliche, but just kind of like that acknowledgement of what you tell them in that room is going to impact kind of all other aspects of their lives. And so from a, I guess, cultural perspective for Nigerians, just asking the patient, I think the patient, asking them if they have any concerns, being able to kind of have an honest conversation with them and not, obviously doctors times time is very precious, but not making them feel rushed or that they can't kind of come to you. And just giving them a moment to sit with the news if you're the one breaking it, or yeah, just kind of small things, I think.
Fundamentally, healthcare is a practice of humans looking after humans, but sometimes it's very ironic how the human side can be forgotten in all of that. I think it's been like one of my favorite things about this conversation has almost been the juxtaposition between navigating a health condition as just generally like a person, and then navigating a health condition whilst you're in a healthcare setting, and how those two things can be different from time to time. You mentioned, I've seen some of the stuff that you do, for instance, with your podcast. And one of the things that you mentioned before is no one tells you how to live with sickle cell or an invisible illness. If I was able to now give you the opportunity, maybe in like a minute, to tell someone how to live with sickle cell specifically, because of course you can't speak for every invisible illness. What are almost like two or three things that you could help someone to almost tell them how to live with their condition? And of course, we can't put it in a box because everybody's different. Everybody has different triggers, but just some tips and tricks just based on your own experience.
First thing, know your triggers and don't ignore your triggers, and really work to manage your triggers. I think for sickle cell, it tends to be kind of similar. So like the cold, stress, intense exercise, infection, and a whole bunch of other things. But for some people, some triggers are more kind of intense than others. So really understand your triggers and don't compromise on them. So for example, if your friends want to go to, I don't know, Alaska, no, obviously it's really cold in Alaska, maybe you don't go, kind of like know to prioritize your health with that, or kind of put in the steps to make sure that you're not going to be caught out. Second thing is to have conversations with your friends and your family and just tell them what you need and not be afraid to ask for help. I think that's a really big one that I struggle with. Even now, I struggle to ask for help. And it can be something small like, hey, can you pick up some paracetamol because I'm running low or whatever. Or it can be big like, hey, I'm in hospital. Can you like come and like, give me some food or fresh clothes or whatever. And then I think the third one is, obviously there are things that you have to be careful about, and things that you maybe not can not necessarily, you will have to think about before doing in comparison to someone else who doesn't have sickle cell, but don't let it kind of limit you, or don't live your life in the fear of kind of like being ill or being in pain and move forward, but with caution, I guess. Like, don't be reckless, but also don't limit yourself because you have sickle cell and you think, oh, actually, I don't know if I can go for this promotion at work because the added stress might be really bad, or I don't know if I can fly to Thailand because the long haul flight might kind of trigger a crisis. So, yeah, there are things that you can do, but just be cautious, I guess.
Amazing. And I mean, if somebody was struggling navigating their condition, living with sickle cell or another invisible illness, I hope that this conversation has almost provided you with some sort of further insight to help you navigate that. Or even if it's just being able to hear Sadia speak about her experience and actually knowing that. Actually, I am also trying to climb up the corporate ladder, but dealing with a chronic illness at the same time and how to almost balance the two. These are the things that when we talk about like having great ambition and climbing social ladders that we never actually touch on, like the other aspects of people's lives is always just work, 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 get a promotion, appease your manager all the way to the top, but never considering the other things which make us perform in those roles. And one thing that we always end the conversation with is asking if you could improve healthcare for your community, how would you do so? And before you answer, could you define who specifically is in your community and how you would improve that healthcare for them if you had a magic wand and you could do absolutely anything?
I would define my community as, I guess, multi hyphenated. So, a Black Muslim woman who's of Nigerian descent. And if I were to have a magic wand and improve that, I would say I think there's a lot of things that kind of play into your health. So, your race, your gender, even your religion and your cultural background. And I think, you know, we're all aware of like disparities in healthcare due to race or gender, for example. And so one thing I would do is this is a big thing, but I would kind of like, I guess, get rid of those disparities. I think that is a much larger conversation, and obviously that takes time and work, and acknowledgement that there is an issue. But I think those disparities really kind of cause people kind of lose their lives and also lose confidence in the NHS or going to the doctor, which again over time is problematic. So if there's a way to kind of move that kind of stigma, have everyone treated as if they were the same, then that would be amazing. But obviously that's a big sky ambition.
And just to almost further elaborate on that, just from a place of pure curiosity, would you look to almost eliminate those disparities from a perspective of this is what the healthcare system, this is what is happening in the healthcare system, and we're going to try and get rid of the disparities there and all of the associated stigmas? Or would you attack the problem from a point of these are the stigmas that patients have with the existing system, and we're going to try and educate almost patients and like-minded people to almost remove the stigmas from that perspective? Like, how would you go about doing that?
I think it is on the healthcare, so as in whether I would work with the doctors or with the patients.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it comes from doctors because they are the people who are going to be treating patients at the end of the day. And I think once doctors or once you're able to remove the stigma from healthcare, I think that kind of will trickle down into patients feeling comfortable to then actually go to the doctor or have those conversations or not be so afraid or distrusting of Western medicine. So yeah, I would tackle it from the healthcare and doctors' perspective.
Well, thank you so much, Sadia. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. And I hope whoever's listening can get some sort of insight into knowing what it's like to one, navigate the corporate world living with sickle cell, and two, almost how to navigate the healthcare world living with sickle cell. It's been a pleasure for myself to just learn from your experience. And thank you very much for being on our podcast today.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.